Welcome to Tin Tower Talks. This is actually the first episode of this podcast that has a name, and it's also the first episode that is an actual podcast. So you'll be able to not just watch it on YouTube like with previous episodes, but you will also be able to find it on your favorite podcasting platforms. Today, we are going to talk about one of my favorite things that has come out about Pokemon in the past year or so, which is all of the beta Pokemon and all of the development information in general for generations 1 and 2. And I'm joined by two of the people who have helped bring us that information, Catstorm and Rachel from Helix Chamber. Before we really go into it, can you introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your personal background with Pokemon, that kind of thing? Maybe Catstorm, you can go first.
Okay, yeah. I'm kind of the co-creator of Helix Chamber. Um, I live for Pokemon at this point. I've grown up with Pokemon forever, and being able to work on this kind of stuff has been kind of my dream for a long time. And so I've been really excited to work as part of Helix Chamber and bring everything together, and just everything has been amazing.
Cool. And you've been playing since Generation 1?
Yeah.
How about you, Rachel?
So in like sixth grade, my friend introduced me to Pokemon, and I was like, "This is the greatest thing ever!" It combines like my two favorite things, which is catching wild animals and trying to make them be my friends, and video games. So I got blue version and a Game Boy Color for Christmas, and I've just been playing every game ever since. I've always been really interested in like the technical aspects and everything. So all the unused stuff is so cool and mysterious. And I was really honored and excited when I was asked to help with the Helix Chamber stuff because their research is so freaking awesome.
Right. So maybe you can tell me a little bit about how Helix Chamber formed, like what made it all happen.
Well, I've been working on the Pokemon Space World, I've been researching it for since about 2017. And then about a year later, my friend Orchid and I, we decided to make a group together when a lot of those beta Pokemon from the first generation were released in that in Satoshi Taji's biographical manga. Um and then after that I was joined by Luminosis, and then we all made a Discord server together. And then, like, immediately after the Space World prototype ROM came out, and we kind of kicked into gear, made our own Twitter and all that. And a couple months later, I ended up making the site. That's kind of how we started, and we just kind of garnered people from everywhere.
So was it just fortuitous, I guess, that the Space World demo came out right after you started working on it?
Yeah, it was a beautiful coincidence. I've been like working on searching for stuff of it, like finding the Firestarter picture of that for like 2 years, and it just kind of blew my mind. So the fact that we were able to be involved with that from as soon as it got out to everyone was amazing.
Yeah, that was an incredible development. Even the Satoshi Tajiri manga itself is also fantastic. I bought it even though I don't yet read Japanese, but just to have that as an artifact, it's also a beautiful book.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So since then, like since you formed, how have the new discoveries been made? Like, is there some sort of internal organization that you've set up of who does what kind of thing?
Well, our way of organization, it's kind of like everyone's free to do what they want. We have a core team of about 5 people who
Okay.
work on the site content, and then we have a lot of like guests to our Discord that help us with research that we credit whenever possible. But like all of us kind of have their own specialty. Like I work with a lot of like pre-release material, and I work with Space World, and I'm kind of a researcher by nature. And then Orchid runs the Twitter a lot, and does a lot of research in their own way. Luminosis does a lot of the art for the site, but also they do a lot of video and picture restoration, which is how we got some of the things like the Game Center CX stuff came from
Right.
Luminosis, and a couple other people in Racy, and then everyone else we're kind of free to go after whatever our passion is at the time. And so while we have like a main track of what articles to work on, everyone can also kind of go their own way.
Did you find all these people that are helping out? Were these people that already kind of knew each other ahead of time, or was there some other more concerted effort of finding people to help?
Well, part of them came from, contacts that we knew already. People from Glitch City Laboratories, asked to join. People from Team Space World, came to us because we were actively working on stuff. And other people asked us through DMs or brought research to us or brought to our attention that we invited to our Discord. And so it's kind of a hodgepodge of people we know and people who are becoming newly acquainted with us.
That's awesome. It's really nice just in general, seeing communities come together for this kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, since you are part of both a Space World and Helix Chamber, could you speak a little bit to like the differences between the two groups?
Well, the main difference is that Space World was kind of a group made to investigate and disassemble the Space World ROM, as well as put all the information on the cutting room floor, things like that. And that was formed by completely different people. The only way I got into Space World was because people knew I was the one working on a significant part of the Space World research, and I got invited into the group because of that. But the difference between us, Helix Chamber, and Space World is that we aren't really in charge of like disassembling the whole thing or translating the whole thing. Most of our members are kind of know it secondhand, and we work with that information ourselves.
Rachel, how about you? How did you get involved?
So I have like several friends in Team Space World, and so when that came out, I was like, I really want to draw these weird like proto Pokemon. They're fantastic. They really deserve like official like art, because they're never gonna get it for real. So I had been drawing a bunch of them, and I was like, I'm gonna draw all of them. I drew like all 100, and so when the Kotora article was going to come out on Helix Chamber, I was asked, hey, can we use your Kotora and Raitora art for this? And I was like, yeah, that would be awesome. So after that, I ended up getting invited so that I could help work on other art stuff like that. Like, kind of Sugimori-ish restorations of the unused Pokemon.
Yeah, and your art has definitely seen a lot of use. I imagine more use than you've been credited for. But
yeah. I mean, I put all of that particular artwork in a Dropbox and like added a readme that's like, hey, you can use this stuff if it's like not for profit and you give credit. I mean, I've still had like those are pretty easy rules to follow, but I've still had some issues with people not paying attention.
Yeah, I imagine. But mostly you've been just doing the art, or are you also involved in some of the research side of things?
Well, I like to say I'm an armchair coder because I understand a lot of like theoretical coding stuff and things like that, but if I was to sit and like actually try to disassemble or do this like kind of data searching that other people do, it's like I don't know where to start. So a lot of it is art, but yeah, mainly art stuff. But I really like reading the research and everything, just looking stuff over.
Yeah, no, and I think the art is also really important for getting people to pay attention. I think that even though the research itself is very interesting, I think that without something that's like visually appealing, something that will grab people's attention, especially the kind of beta Pokemon where you can recognize it as an existing Pokemon, but it's also different. I think that kind of thing really gets people to pay attention. Both sides are very important. And so I actually wanted to ask you what you think this kind of archival work, like digital archaeology, or whatever you might want to call it, why do you think that's important? Why is that the kind of thing that we're interested in? Why do we care about that? And I've been trying to think of an answer for this since before I asked either of you to join the chat, and I have not been able to come up with an answer for myself.
Well, I mean, it really boils down to the question of why is work important to us, creative work. For me, it's my personal view is that the more information I get about the development of these games, about a lot of games in general, is show me how much work goes into making a game and how much work goes into creative development. Like if you look at the beginning at Capsule Monsters, it doesn't really have its original flavor yet, and that came to be developed over the next 5 years. And
Right.
I think finding all this development information and preserving it can really show people and inspire other people that working as a team, you can make something amazing like Pokemon.
Yeah, and I think in the past week or two, having this knowledge of how much work actually goes into Pokemon has become especially relevant with the discussions following the announcement at E3 that not all Pokemon would be included in Sword and Shield. And I've seen a lot of reactions that are saying, the developers are lazy or whatever. And that's just it's kind of disheartening to see that when we've seen that even the most basic of the Pokemon games was what, like 6-7 years in development.
Yeah, I think yes, I've had a completely different opinion on things like this now that I've gotten more information about how much effort gets put into the games and how the developers have to work. And so I pretty much have gained a lot of trust and respect for the developers and kind of let
Mm-hmm.
them do their thing at this point. Even if, it's not every Pokemon, I'm fine with it.
Do you think that it makes sense from their perspective to try and keep this development kind of information private, or would it be
Yeah.
more beneficial for them maybe to release this kind of document in a more official fashion, especially for the really old games?
I think it's a yes and no question because if there's anything I've learned also from looking at these materials, it's that a lot of information, a lot of programming and art is still used up into the modern games. For example, we just saw the release of a Pokemon Diamond prototype, and some of those debug functions kind of match what was in Space World and what's left over in Red and Green to a bit of
Oh
an
wow.
extent. And so I'm seeing that not only is it like an intellectual property problem, but it's also there are things in there they can still pull from. Like in Space World, they pulled a lot of those ideas for evolutions that they scrapped into Generation 4 for a lot of evolutions like Tangela.
Mm-hmm.
But really, I think the culture in Japan is different where the companies are a lot more private with their information. But I still think it's important to preserve because you see things like Final Fantasy where they lost the source code for 7, 8, and 9, and so they had to like rebuild the games from the PlayStation data because they couldn't go back and use the source because it didn't exist anymore. And so even if it's private, I respect if a company resorts to private archival of their information and data and stuff. But yeah, it could go both ways. There are benefits to public or private, but preservation itself I think is probably really important in general.
Do you feel any kind of I don't know, moral objection to making public, especially things with like the beta prototypes, that kind of thing, that weren't made officially public, like something that was in the Tajiri manga, for example, like that is public information now. But the stuff with Space World, for example, or the Green Beta, that didn't come through official channels. So, is that something that you think about?
Oh, absolutely. That's like kind of the core of our moral like question when we talk about and publish this stuff. This is something that the developers can't talk about probably for legal reasons. And whoever, releases this stuff is getting it out there without their permission. And so it's kind of that question, but at the same time, whatever comes into our hands, be it Space World or assets, we want to be able to analyze it and show everyone. I mean, it's kind of a question of it's important to a lot of people, and it's done with the most respect for the developers. It's a question that we still think about every day when we discuss this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if there's actually a morally like I don't have a strong moral standpoint because of that, but I still work with the information that comes out those ways.
Yeah, and I think it's good to have these kinds of questions floating around. I think I heard this from Hank Green, who said that it's important to have complex opinions about things.
Oh yeah.
That it's good to not have, a completely clear-cut view, that the complexity in a way helps you see things more completely.
Right. Like when the Space World ROM came out, I almost wonder if the designers feel kind of a sense of like secondhand embarrassment because those are their old scrap designs. Like, from our analysis, a lot of those were works by Atsuko Nishita. You can tell it's her art style. And I always kind of feel bad because those kind of things feel more private than others. Like someone's embarrassing art being leaked onto the internet feels a
Right.
little sad. So it does have a lot of complexities and different like ways you can look at it. And we try to take those into account when we work with this.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that the art, does feel a little bit more personal than something like the Index of Cries, for example. That feels more like just data.
Yeah.
Speaking of the Pokemon designs, what is it about beta Pokemon designs that gets everyone so excited? Why are we so interested in the Pokemon that could have been when we know that, at least in that form, they are almost certainly not going to come back? Like, maybe they'll be reworked in some way into a future Pokemon, but...
I think that like when you look at a Pokemon like Kotora where everyone really loves it and wonders why it's not in the game, but you can tell that there was a logical reason why they wouldn't put it in, probably like kind of diversify in a way or to balance the game out. It's still really cool to see because you can see where an original idea came from. Like if you look at Cubone Marowak and then its prototype evolution from the red and green um assets, you can see where they were going with Marowak because the third evolution has a baby Cubone with it, and that kind of information tells you a lot more about how they came up with the storyline where Marowak's mother is killed by Team Rocket in the first generation games, and kind of shows how kind of backwardsly explains why it has that connection to Kangaskhan that seemed obvious in the fandom for a long time, but wasn't really like shown as a parallel until we saw that previous deleted evolution for it. In conclusion, it's like you can see all their ideas where they were coming from with things like this. And then just seeing like Pokemon whose designs were scrapped entirely, like Crocky, who was in the first generation. We saw him in the Tajiri manga. It's just adorable. Like some of these designs are just cool and cute, and people want them as real Pokemon, even if they don't fully fit with the idea that Game Freak came up with in the end and the kind of world. They're still impressive designs. They're still really fun and amazing, and I love seeing every one of them. And that's probably why they're the most popular thing about the prototype Pokemon content is the Pokemon themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, for me, it's like looking at all of these designs and being like, I could have been buying merch of this for like 20 years and then they denied me.
Yeah.
But like, it's really funny seeing people's reactions to different designs because a lot of them are clearly really unpolished, but I still see people saying, oh my gosh, this is the best thing ever. I wish we had this. Or seeing designs that changed drastically, like a lot of the Space World stuff, like Ella Baby eventually became Ella Kid, but I love Ella Baby. It looks like a weird little Kirby enemy. It's so cute.
Right.
Like, why couldn't these coexist? And it's just interesting because I think a lot of people saw those and felt like, hey, we could have had all this extra stuff the whole time, but it's like that's not really the case because they were all works in progress and they were removed for various reasons. And maybe like with Gen 4 borrowing from Space World, we might see them again sometime. Although it's been a pretty long time since they considered these designs, and I don't know, they probably have some vault somewhere in Game Freak that's got like a book full of these.
I hope so.
It's interesting though because like James Turner had like shown photos of the Tajiri manga when it came out. He was like, hey, look at these cool unused designs. And when Space World came out, people asked him, hey, have you seen these? He's like, that's interesting. Nope. I mean, I don't know if he honestly hadn't seen them or he
right.
he couldn't say. But I think it's interesting if they've got these types of designs lying around and maybe they don't even know they got them in a back room or something. Kind of makes me wonder if like the public release of these things has them looking at these designs again, maybe reconsidering them. I mean, that would be maybe the best case scenario for me. Like if they were like, "Hey, Kotora is pretty good. We should stick him in Gen 9 or something."
I would love that as well.
Yeah.
I want Goro to come back because that was their own admission in the first place. I look forward to the possibility, even if they said he's not going to come back. I just have a little glimmer of hope.
Yeah, and I think we have seen some like echoes of those original designs. Like I thought that baby Zubat from the green beta looked a lot like Woobat.
Yeah.
Like a tiny Woobat.
Well, yeah, because like that's, I mean, like looking at how Gen 4 was looking at Space World stuff, it's possible that they were looking at this Gen 1 stuff for 5 since it was sort of a reboot kind of thing, and there's a lot of parallels with Gen 1 in the new decks. So it's possible they're like, hey, let's make a weird round bat again.
Yeah, no, that's fair because they did reuse a lot of concepts for Gen 5. A lot of times the designs are completely different, but the Pokemon fill the same roles, like Timber and Machop have essentially the same role. So yeah, that's an interesting thought that maybe they did actually reuse or at least look at some of those beta designs that they scrapped, but maybe make something new out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, we kind of have a theory going that even the scrapped ones like have their own place in the Gen 5 decks. Can't think of any off the top of my head because I haven't looked at that in a while, but it's really amazing.
But basically the idea is that those scrap designs have been kind of re-implemented in some way in Gen 5.
Yeah.
We've got like Maractus in Gen 5, right? And then we had Cactus in Gen 1.
Yeah.
There's possibilities like that. It's like, well, they're both just cactuses, but we've seen that they do reuse concepts, even if they're not exactly the same.
Yeah, and I mean, even with Pokemon that were already released, we have seen them. We have seen designs change a little bit, right? Like a Charmander now is a fair bit different from a Charmander in Generation 1. So especially if you're looking at pre-release stuff, changes are absolutely to be expected.
That's another kind of amazing part. Like, we've been researching Generation 3, and we know just that Kecleon's art is like, it's missing a fin in older pictures of it, and then later they just stuck the fin back on, and that's kind of blown our minds.
Oh, like on its head?
No, the fin on its back. Like,
on its back, yeah.
Its art, it's been there on its sprite, but in its art, it was not shown for a long time until they edited it and fixed it out. It's little details like that that are always kind of amazing to find, even if it's not the super biggest detail, but shows kind of a humanism to how they were developed. Like in Kadabra's art, you can see it's missing. It looks like a finger was erased from it. It's things like that show how much of a kind of a fluid game, how its art style can be fluid in the way that they develop things.
I feel like that was especially the case in Generations 1 and 2, where a lot of times, even between the released art and the released sprite, there were sometimes some inconsistencies. I'm trying to think now of an exact example.
Coughing would be a good one.
Yeah.
Right, yeah. And so, like, back then, it kind of feels like the designs of Pokemon weren't so strict. I imagine that they standardized things more for the purposes of merchandise. So now, every depiction of a Charmander is going to look like the same Charmander. But I feel like that wasn't always the case before. There was also Arbok, who for, I think, up to Generation 3 had different patterns every time. And, that was really fascinating, but it's not something that we see anymore.
I think a lot of that is also has to do with like the change in how they design and how they code the things. Because like in Gen 1 and 2, it seems every artist drew their designs directly into whatever they used to make the games. They just started with the sprite art. Each person was like, I'm going to make such and such, and they just drew it. And then Sugimori would base his art on the sprites, and he'd do whatever changes or touch-ups he felt like doing. Like in later gens, you see, like, sometimes they release concept art and stuff. You can see that they plan everything out on paper first. They pass it around. They all, vote on what's good, what should change and stuff. And that all happens before the things go into the game, and it becomes way more consistent in like style and quality.
Although Arbok's patterns, they try to explain that in the Pokédex by saying each region has a different pattern, which is kind of humorous, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think another thing is probably technological limitations. Like, you can add more details to the Pokemon now because you have more room for models and sprites.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I'm sure back then they were allowed to be a little bit more lenient with how they made the sprites and what was consistent. I think up until, like you said, when the merchandising started becoming a thing. Even in Blue, they had which was about maybe 7 or 6 months after the initial games. They were messing around with the designs a lot, especially like Gracie said with like coughing. It's really interesting to see how the popularity turned it into having to have a standardized design for every Pokemon.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's a good thing? Or do you
I
think
think
that we've
yes,
kind of lost something?
I think yes and no. I think there's qualities to both the more standardized Pokemon now and the freer kind of reign they had back then. I like the original way that they did it, but
Mm-hmm.
having a model for every Pokemon is probably incredibly useful to developers and probably the fan artists as well. Like we've been trying to draw these Pokemon from the beta, um, from just their sprites because they have no official art that was ever
Mm-hmm.
released, and everyone has kind of a different interpretation. And while it's been really fun, at the same time it can be a little frustrating since we don't have a standard model to work off of.
I imagine that must have been even more challenging when you did the front sprite art for the green beta designs. I imagine that was very challenging because back sprites are incredibly low resolution.
Like a lot of that stuff, some of it was easier to interpret than others. Like it's pretty easy to guess what evolution of Marowak that sort of looks like Kangaskhan should look like. I mean, we still don't have all the details. Like, I've seen people discussing, like, is it holding a bone? Does it have a pouch? Is it holding the little Cubone? Like, those are interesting questions, and some of them were way more ambiguous than others. Like, we considered everything we knew about the Pokemon when we tried to decipher them. Like, like there were some we couldn't quite figure out what they were until we looked at their move sets. And they were like, hey, they have like kicking and punching and stuff in here and like some water attacks. So we sort of formed maybe a better image of what they might have been like from that. But it was it was incredibly difficult. I think the second hardest part is like, okay, I have some idea of what this might be. So how would this look in like a Gen 1 Sugimori style? And how do I design it like this and make sure that I didn't accidentally change it too much and now it doesn't fit the back sprite we know kind of thing.
Right.
Like a really difficult one was Gorochu. We didn't recognize it as such until we saw the evolution data. Because at
Mm.
first we are like, what is this? Some kind of weird walrus or something? It sort of looked maybe icy. Is this like a dugong evolution? It's like, I guess Gorochu's not in the game. And then we, because it didn't match the description we had, which
Right.
was like, two horns and fangs and stuff. And we're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
So we're trying to design something that A, matches this weird back sprite we have, B, looks like it would evolve from Raichu, and C, it also looks like it could have existed, as Sugimori art in that style. And it was incredibly difficult.
Yeah. I had some fun designing my own take on Gorochu as well. And it was really fun seeing like all the different takes because I've seen many, right? A lot of people took that on. So that was a lot of fun
Yeah,
to play around with. Um,
I
and-
I loved a lot of the ones we saw before we ever had any inkling of what it looked like, and I
mhm,
was kind of disappointed it looked so different than what people expected. Because it
right.
was like, well, heck, how do I make it look cool? Because it looks really weird from.
Yeah, I think I saw a couple from before the back sprite was found that actually looked like somewhat close, that kind of hit some of the same points, and that was really interesting. Speaking of the sprites from Generation 1, I've always found this kind of thought experiment, I guess, of because the early sprites, from Red and Green, the ones that didn't even come to the West, some of those are really wacky, and I've always thought about, like, what if we didn't have the Sugimori concept art for them? Like, I think Pokemon would have been different. Like, it would have been a different franchise. I think it would have appealed to different people.
I mean, I know with me, like a big part of my initial attraction to the series was seeing the Sugimori art. And like, I guess he was going for like a Toriyama sort of style. It's way more obvious in his super early stuff, but like even stuff like Rattata or Pidgey, I thought looked so awesome. I wanted to play the game that these things were in.
Mm-hmm.
If we just had the sprites, I probably would still like it, but I wonder how my perception would be different about the games going into them.
Yeah. So, especially, like, I know that part of the reason that they changed the sprites for Pokemon Blue and for the Western release was because they didn't look like the art in the manual, right? My understanding is that some people complained about that. The sprites that we see in Yellow, for example, they are already quite a bit closer to the like standardized designs that we see nowadays. Whereas some of the sprites from earlier than that, they are so different.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. I mean, it's hard to think about a version of the game coming out where you wouldn't have that art because it was so prominent in the merchandising even before the games came out. In magazines and in posters, you can see the art for every Pokemon there. It's almost inherently kind of part of the game and definitely part of the franchise and the reason it got so popular, probably.
For sure.
I mean, it probably makes sense that they used the blue art in some cases because they updated all the sprites and gave them a little better, in some cases they gave them more like energetic poses or gave them better, you can tell, make it out a little better. And some of the original guys, like Rhydon, kind of got redesigned so they didn't all look like the same pose with the big bulging eyes that kind of were freaky.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I was raised mostly on the yellow art, 'cause my first Generation 1 game is the yellow version.
Yeah, same.
So going back and seeing the red and blue art and the sprites, I mean, was pretty interesting, but then going back to the green art just kind of surprised me, and it surprised, like, anyone who's grown up only with, the American, sprites that we got. Although I do always think, like, what would it be like if, the red and green sprites stayed the same? It would be kind of wild.
Yeah. Do you think that we've kind of lost something a little bit from moving away from sprites and having Pokemon be introduced now as 3D models?
I think yes and no, like a lot of my answers already. For a long time, I worked as like a sprite artist on like Pokemon like splices a lot when I was a kid. And every generation's new sprites were always really impressive, and I got really excited to, Generation 5 when it came out. When they switched to 3D models, I stopped really doing sprites, which was kind of funny, but I
Yeah.
think, like, I'm trying to, like, imagine. I've been thinking about this for a while. When you look at the beast Pokemon from Sun and Moon, I think it would be hard to express some of those guys as sprites. Like, you look at like Celesteela and Big Stack Attack and a couple others that are just huge, and it's hard to kind of imply that their otherworldliness, their kind of complexity, if you just leave them as sprites. And I think less details would be obvious. I think it's just going in a different direction now because they have the 3D modeling technology, but I don't think it's an entirely bad direction. That's pretty much my opinion on it.
Yeah, no, I think that the new Pokemon designs are very good, but in terms of their presentation in the game, I do feel like the pixel art sometimes had something more.
Oh, absolutely. Like,
Yeah.
a lot of people use Typhlosion or Nidoking as an example because they
Yeah.
look a little silly in 3D, and they never updated the models, which takes a lot of time and effort, as we've kind of discussed recently in the community.
Yeah.
I've heard it, like, I've heard a lot of sentiment lately that, they should go back to pixel art because, like, using like really beautiful fan art and stuff as examples. And I mean, there's good stuff about both mediums. It makes the most sense that they would move to 3D when their consoles move to 3D.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes the most sense for just the series moving forward and technology moving forward. I don't see any reason that they couldn't use sprite art in like side games and stuff. I mean, they still like to use it for like interface elements like your
Yeah.
party members or like for items and little stuff like that.
Yeah, I love that.
I think one of my main issues with the models, and a lot of other people have pointed this out, is that like if you go back and look at Stadium or like Battle Revolution, those
Mm-hmm.
were the real old models, but they also seemed a lot more lively in animation. And I feel like that's something that they could fix with the current models. And it sounds like maybe they are looking at that because one of their answers, when people were like talking about the National Dex issue, they were saying, well, we want to make our models that we have more expressive and more lively.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that's one of the things that they're addressing because like with Typhlosion was an example, it just kind of stands there.
Yeah.
And people look at its sprites where it's got its mane flared up and everything, and it looks so cool, but if you look at it in the game, it doesn't look that cool. But like when you look at Score Bunny, for example, in the demo and stuff, it's hopping around all over the place. It looks really lively. I'm hoping we'll see more sorts of like exciting animation like that. I think that would help a lot with people's perspective of, the art style shift. And
Mm-hmm.
there's always going to be people who overall just prefer the pixel art, which is fine. That makes sense. But I think that there's a lot they can do with the 3D models that they just couldn't do with just sprite art. And I would like to see them, expand the games more like that.
It's kind of interesting thinking about this because I feel like back when we were in the pixel art era, as a fan base, we always wanted a 3D Pokemon game, a 3D RPG experience, a main series game in 3D. And now that we are in 3D, we've seen a lot of this opinion that oh, maybe the pixel art's better.
Yeah, it's a bit of a monkey's paw situation.
Yeah, I feel like the fan base is so big that it's practically impossible to just satisfy everyone. Whatever you do, someone's not going to like it.
Yeah, like they've taken away and put features back in every game, and I think they're trying to kind of find a way, like Smash Brothers Ultimate, to kind of provide an example, is a bit of a way to make everyone happy because it includes every single character
Mm-hmm.
that was, or even the ones that were removed, and it's put a lot of pressure on Sakurai. So I can see where the developers are trying to not only like keep things from getting too overcomplicated in Pokemon, but also they just can't satisfy everyone.
Yeah, no, even with Smash Ultimate, even though it has every character, I've still seen people complain about things that it doesn't have, like not having mini games like Target Smash and Home Run Contest. Whatever you do, you're never gonna satisfy everyone. So I can support them doing what they think is right, and it's probably gonna work out in the long term. Well, unless you two have something more that you would like to add, I think we can wrap this up here.
I do have one thing. I just want to, I don't know, thank everybody for like just supporting and linking to our site all the time. I can't like deal sometimes with like seeing it mentioned on places like Polygon and Normal Boots. It's just kind of amazing. And I want to again thank everybody because it's just kind of a passion project with me and my friends. And to see it kind of be spotlighted all the time is like, I'm just always amazed. And I want to thank you for having us on and all that.
Oh yeah, no, it's my pleasure. I still feel like I'm just starting out with this podcast. I mean, it's the first time that it's actually going to be a podcast, but I think that this kind of topic and featuring people and subgroups of the community that are prominent and that are doing things that are interesting and unique, I think it's important. We need to show our appreciation for the work that you're doing.
We really appreciate that.
Yeah, so thank you, Catstorm and Rachel, for joining me today. The links to Helix Chamber's website, their Twitter, as well as Catstorm and Rachel's personal Twitters will be in the description.
Look forward to our next article and our next tweets. Watch more of the podcast.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm always looking forward for more stuff coming from you guys. So
I just want to say, I hope Kortora becomes real.
I think we all do. If you enjoy Tin Tower Talks, you can like, subscribe, comment, whatever platform you are listening to this allows you to do. And if you would like to give some more support, you can also support me on Patreon. I'm Umbreon Libris, and I will see you in the next chapter.